Korean President Park Geun-hye calls for an emergency meeting and expresses deep regret over Pyongyang's Thursday shelling across the inter-Korean maritime border. Day 2 of local election campaigning in Korea. What are the hottest battlegrounds and a pulse check on the voter sentiment? And former Thai Prime Minister Shinawatra, along with other political figures, reports to the military junta the power grab in a coup, while world leaders denounce the military coup. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Kang Tae-ri in Seoul. President Park Geun-hye called for a meeting with her security ministers on this Friday following North Korea's shelling across the western maritime border the night before. She expressed a deep regret over Pyongyang's latest provocation as South Korea is still mourning the loss of hundreds of lives from last month's ferry disaster. The president called on the military and related agencies to stay focused on protecting the safety of South Koreans living on the western sea border islands. She also discussed bolstering Seoul's defense readiness with Washington and cooperating with neighboring countries like China when it comes to North Korea issues. And we have a North Korean reaction in this story, which is denial. North Korea's state-run TV carried a statement from its Southwest Front Command, claiming instead that it was South Korea that went over the maritime border, the same borderline that Pyongyang has said it does not recognize. And here is a clip of the statement being read by a North Korean newsreader.
South Korea's puppet navy intruded deep into our waters after crossing the maritime demarcation line and fired at us first. They made the excuse of cracking down on peaceful Chinese fishing boats, and then they invented a fraudulent scenario.
And in other story, Washington's plan to slap more sanctions on North Korea to put its provocations and threats in check is threatening to further damage U.S.-China relations. The envisioned measures, which could actively target Chinese companies in North Korea, come at a time when Washington and Beijing are already at odds over another sensitive issue. Kim Hyun-bin tells us more.
The already tense relations between the U.S. and China could be exacerbated in the coming weeks and months by North Korean issues. The New York Times reported this week that Washington is weighing up whether to impose further sanctions on Pyongyang that target Chinese enterprises in the north. This option came to the fore last month when U.S. President Barack Obama held summit talks with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in Tokyo. The two leaders specifically discussed more targeted sanctions on the North Korean regime that could cut off the flow of Chinese money into the country. North Korea is almost completely dependent on China, its only remaining ally, for trade. China accounted for nearly 90% of North Korean trade last year. On a slightly different topic, the New York Times article also said President Obama was not involved in the Justice Department's decision to indict 5 Chinese military officers for hacking. It added, however, that the move was consistent with Obama's belief that Washington needs to get tough on China on this issue. The U.S. accuses Chinese President Xi Jinping of ignoring repeated demands for his government to stop hacking into American firms and stealing trade secrets. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News.
On May 24, 2010, 4 years ago tomorrow, South Korea imposed heavy economic sanctions on North Korea for its torpedo attack on a South Korean warship, which killed 46 South Korean soldiers. But our Hwang Sang-yu reports on how these sanctions are getting in the way of inter-Korean ties.
The 결의말 큰사전 Committee started out in 2005 with an ambitious goal to narrow the language gap between the two Koreas by creating a joint dictionary. Divided into 2 teams, from the south and north, they had been meeting about 4 times a year to work on the dictionary. But the project has been at a standstill ever since the May 24th sanctions were put in place.
We haven't been able to hold meetings with the North Korean committee since 2010. The South Korean committee has finished our portion of the work over the 4 years. But we must receive the North Korean portion, which will make up about half of the dictionary.
Following North Korea's sinking of Cheonan warship, South Korea cut off all financial support to the north and suspended inter-Korean projects except for the jointly run Kaesong Industrial Complex. fact, many North Korea experts are now calling for these sanctions to be lifted, saying that it will be the first vital step for opening up a new era of reunification of the two Koreas. Most of President Park Geun-hye's inter-Korean project proposals, such as the Eurasia Initiative, a construction of railways running from South Korea to Europe via North Korea, Russia, and China, demand fresh investments in the north. But will the sanctions be lifted once and for all?
Rather than an immediate lifting of the May 24th sanctions, South Korea could become more flexible with the measures following its local elections on June 4th, and as positive changes are seen in inter-Korean relations and North Korea's nuclear program.
But Seoul says the May 24th sanctions will remain in place until Pyongyang takes responsibility for the Cheonan attack. 황상희, Arirang News.
When the 17th Asian Games kick off in the South Korean city of Incheon this coming September, it looks like North Korean athletes might be there competing for medals. North Korean state media made the announcement Friday upon a decision by North Korea's Olympic Committee, which added that they were taking all necessary steps to participate. The South Korean government had said earlier this year that North Korean athletes were welcome at the Games. This will be Pyongyang's fourth straight appearance since 2002 Asian Games, Busan.
For the latest in news that impacts Korea and the world, join Kang Chae-ri for a lively half hour that covers politics, business, international news, and much more. Live at 8 every weeknight on Arirang TV.
Human Rights Council headquarters in Geneva on Thursday, finding ways to. With Korea's local elections set for June 4th, we're trying to figure out how the April ferry disaster is going to impact the outcome of the elections, with the government criticized for its poor handling of the accident. And polls did show a sharp drop in support for the ruling party immediately after the accident, but that number has been picking up, suggesting President Park Geun-hye's apology and moves to shake up her people may have given the party a little bit of a boost. Park Ji-won tells us more.
The failed handling of the Sewol-ho ferry disaster has hit the incumbent administration hard. Since the accident in mid-April, President Park Geun-hye's approval rating had been on a steady decline, dropping to 51% in the second week of May, according to public opinion research firm Realmeter. But the president's apology to the nation this week may have turned the tide. Media research has Park's approval rating rebounding to the 60% range for the first time since the ferry disaster, up to 62%. Research View also says President Park's public address on Monday pushed up her positive ratings by 4 percentage points this week compared to the previous one. Both polls surveyed some 1,000 people nationwide over the age of 19. Political analysts say her appointing of reform-minded former Supreme Court Justice An Dae-hee as new prime minister and accepting the resignations of her top security advisors could also play a role in gathering conservative support at the elections.
Due to prevailing negative views about the ruling party following its poor handling of the disaster, conservative-inclined voters weren't able to outwardly express their support for the ruling party. The president's call for changes means the ability to support conservative candidates has been restored to some degree.
However, in a survey conducted by Research and Research, 40% of respondents said the ferry disaster affected their voting decisions, and nearly 60% of them said their support has shifted to opposition parties. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Now let's take a look at the hottest battlegrounds for the June local elections and check on where voters stand in these regions. Ji Myung-gil with this report.
The metropolitan cities of Seoul and Incheon, along with Gyeonggi-do province, are shaking out to be the fiercest battlegrounds in this local election. Senior member of the ruling Saenuri Party plan to join the campaign trail next week to throw their weight behind their mayoral hopefuls in Seoul and Incheon. They need all the help they can get. Ruling party candidate for Seoul Mayor Chung Mong-jun, who is trailing by 19 points in the polls behind incumbent Park Geun-hye, handed out food to elderly citizens at a welfare center while Park had lunch with college students. Over in the western port city of Incheon, the ruling party's mayoral candidate Yoo Jong-bok is also behind in the polls by more than 6 percentage points. He and his challenger in the race, incumbent Song Young-gil, visited elderly community centers. And in Gyeonggi-do province, where the race for governor is much tighter, the main opposition candidate Kim Jin-pyo of the New Politics Alliance for Democracy was joined on the campaign trail by co-chairman of the party, An Chol-soo. The ruling party's Nam Kyung-pil, who's in a neck-and-neck race with Kim, shook hands with the elderly at a welfare center in the city of Seongnam. An Chol-soo's presence in Gyeonggi was for a reason, as a win by the NPAD there would constitute a major win, as the province has a greater population than Seoul. The main opposition alliance is trying to appeal to undecided voters who may be disappointed by the government's poor handling of April's ferry disaster. Kim Young-gil, Arirang News.
Now, if we try really hard to give any positive spin to last month's ferry disaster story, we can talk about the fact that the accident pushed lawmakers here in Korea to take a long, hard look at an old bill that would redefine what constitutes corruption among public officials. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
An anti-corruption bill in Korea is gaining traction, a public outrage of the Seoul ferry tragedy. Lawmakers will likely vote on the so-called Kim Young-lan bill, which is aimed at raising the bar of ethical practices for public officials. The bill is named after former Supreme Court Justice Kim Young-lan, who first proposed it during her term as chief of the Anticorruption and Civil Rights Commission of Korea. The bill sets grounds to criminally punish retired and incumbent public officials for colluding with interest groups. Bribery is defined in the legislation as a transfer of money or valuables worth more than 1 million Korean won, or about $976 between a public official and interest group, even if the deal is not followed by a favor. Lawmakers have been divided over the bill. Some have stood firmly against it since it was first proposed in 2012, claiming the bill would unnecessarily restrict the private lives of public servants. But there's been a shift after the ferry accident, as public calls have grown louder about reforms to ensure that similar tragedies don't occur. The Kim Young-lan bill has been forwarded to the Parliament's National Policy Committee for approval. If it passes there, it will be sent to a full session of the National Assembly, which could pass it as early as next week. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Japan has once again been called out for ignoring its past wrongdoings, this time by a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Loretta Sanchez didn't just aim her latest comments at Tokyo, but also called on her colleagues in the Senate to take action, do something, and make sure the former comfort women receive justice. Connie Kim has the story.
A U.S. congresswoman in the Armed Services Committee has called on Japan to officially apologize for its sexual enslavement of women during World War II. Loretta Sanchez, co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Korea, said at a meeting that Japan had still not apologized to the victims it caused to suffer more than 70 years and that their human rights need to be upheld. Urging her fellow congressmen to support the surviving comfort women, Sanchez called on the Japanese government to uphold a U.S. resolution passed in 2007 that calls on Tokyo to formally acknowledge, apologize, and accept its historical responsibility for enslaving women during World War II and educate future generations of the horrific crimes that were carried out. Sanchez said earlier this month in a military plenary session that Japan's comfort women issue cannot be dealt separately in the Obama administration's Asia rebalancing strategy. She warned that Japan needed to resolve its long-standing disputes in the region first. Experts say, however, Washington is taking a two-track approach towards Japan.
The U.S. welcomes Japan's push to restore its right to collective self-defense, but at the same time condemns Japan's historical wrongdoings. We can't say whether Washington values human rights issues more than they do security.
Lee added that Washington can always change its stance on the comfort women issue depending on its political interests in East Asia. Currently, less than 100 women of the 200,000 so-called comfort women are alive today. Meanwhile, a Japanese policy research center published a book in English recently that denies the past enforcement of sexual slavery. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
The Korean government and the nuclear energy industry are taking preemptive steps to prevent power shortages during the hot and sticky summer season. The Energy Ministry says the country's nuclear power plants have been undergoing a special inspection this month. The inspection, running through the end of June, is in the wake of last year's energy crisis and is separate from regular checkups. Last summer, several nuclear reactors went offline either due to regular inspections or because they were found to have used parts with forged safety certificates. The Korean government had to ask the public to voluntarily slash their energy use when the country was hit by a prolonged heat wave last year. Korea has a total of 23 nuclear reactors, and they provide around 1/3 of the country's total energy supply. An achievement for Samsung, the electronics giant has unseated Sony as the #1 maker of UHD TV's ultra-high-definition televisions. Samsung claimed 22% of the global UHD TV market in the first quarter, according to U.S. market analyzer Display Search. Sony, #1 last year, fell all the way down to #5 with less than a 10% share. The military coup in Thailand is facing widespread condemnation from international leaders after troops dispersed protest camps there across the kingdom. With more on this story, we are joined by Paul E. at the News Center. So, Paul, it looks like the Thai army has almost completed its takeover of the government, all without any bloodshed so far. But do we know what their next move might be?
Well, still unclear at this point, but one day after the Thai military announced it was staging a coup d'etat, they called in ousted Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra for questioning, along with more than 100 other political figures. Our Kwon So-ah has more on this latest development.
Thailand's ousted Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra and more than 100 other political figures made an appearance for questioning at a military facility in Bangkok Friday on the army's request. There was no immediate word on what Yingluck or the others were asked about. It comes after the Thai military suspended most of the constitution and imposed a travel ban on 155 politicians after announcing a military coup d'etat on Thursday. They say the goal is to end the ongoing political turmoil in the country, but world leaders have been quick to condemn the move. It came just 2 days after the army's sudden declaration of martial law Tuesday, plus their earlier denial of a possible coup. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said there was no justification for the coup and warned of negative consequences.
At this point, what we're doing is we are reviewing our military and other assistance to the government of Thailand. We've taken preliminary steps to suspend military engagement and assistance while we consider the facts on the ground.
United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon voiced deep concern over the threat to the human rights of the Thai people and appealed for a prompt return to constitutional and democratic rule, as well as all-inclusive dialogue. The so far bloodless coup includes a nationwide curfew of 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., and soldiers have dispersed demonstrators at 2 main protest sites. Government programming is filling the airwaves and international news channels are blocked. Korea's foreign ministry raised its level 1 travel advisory that was in effect for much of Thailand to a level 2 on Friday, meaning travelers should take caution when traveling to or within the country. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
And it's been 1 day since China's deadliest act of violence in the northeastern region of Xinjiang. Paul, at least 31 people were killed and scores others injured in this attack. Are authorities any closer to finding out who is responsible?
The Chinese government says police are still investigating the attack, which has been condemned as a violent terrorist incident. But Chinese state media say that 5 suicide bombers carried out the brutal attack in the capital city of Urumqi. The footage broadcast on this Friday shows broken windows and damaged shops after the attackers plowed 2 vehicles into an open market, hurling explosives. Security remains high around the marketplace, with dozens of riot police patrolling the area. Officials say nearly 100 people are receiving treatment for wounds at nearby hospitals. Most of the victims caught in the blast were elderly shoppers.
The fire burst out suddenly, and I didn't know what was happening. When I turned around, the car was already on top of me here. I felt like there was no one around and struggled to crawl out.
This is the second suicide bombing in Urumqi in just over 3 weeks. Back in late April, a bomb and mass knife attack killed 1 bystander and wounded 79 others. Beijing has blamed the worsening violence on militants and separatists from Xinjiang, home to the Uyghur Muslim minority. But human rights groups say China's repressive policies against religious freedoms may have fomented the unrest.
Now let's go to Ukraine. More than a dozen Ukrainian soldiers have been killed in a firefight with armed rebels in the eastern part of the country. Paul, we've seen growing clashes between the army and pro-Russian rebels, but it looks like this attack was unlike any other.
That's right, Chetty. The interim government in Kiev said its forces were repelling an attack by pro-Russian militants from entering Ukraine's eastern border, but officials are claiming the attack was launched from Russian soil. The early morning clash on Thursday in the eastern Donetsk region left at least 13 troops dead and 32 people injured. However, local authorities are putting the death toll at 16. Top Ukrainian security officials expect even more separatist violence in the coming days. Meanwhile, Ukraine's acting president Alexander Turchinov expressed his condolences to the victims' families, saying the soldiers gave their lives for their country.
During clashes, and their pro-Russian separatists' aim was to attack and seize the city of Volnovatka, our boys defended this city and didn't let them move forward. But regrettably, under fire from mortars, grenade launchers, and heavy gunfire, our soldiers died for Ukraine.
The attack is fueling security concerns ahead of Ukraine's presidential election scheduled on Sunday. Ukraine has also called for an emergency session of the UN Security Council to discuss Moscow's alleged role in the violence.
And finally, before we let you go, Paul, let's talk music and about former Beatles star Paul McCartney. Reports say he's recovering from a serious illness in Japan. Any word on his current condition?
Well, according to his spokesperson, Sir Paul McCartney is expected to make a full recovery. The 71-year-old music legend was being treated at a hospital in Tokyo for a viral infection. Due to his poor health, McCartney had postponed 2 shows in Tokyo and canceled even more concerts that were due to take place this week. Nonetheless, many Japanese fans were relieved to hear the good news.
The shock was huge when I heard the 2 concerts that I bought the tickets for were both canceled. But it's good to hear that he's recovering from the illness. I'll be happy if he can come to Japan again in the near future.
McCartney had also canceled his first ever live concert in Korea, which was scheduled to kick off next week, but there's still no word yet if he'll be up for a performance later this year. Chetty?
All right, Paul, thank you very much for that update, and we'll see you back here in just about 2 hours. And we're seeing some unusually hot spring weather, not summer. Now let's turn to our Michelle Park for more details. Michelle.
Good evening. Now, daytime highs have been on the rise this week, reaching up to 5 degrees higher than the average seasonal temperature for this time of the year. Now, skies are looking very clear and sunny, and similar conditions are in store for us tomorrow. However, rain is in the forecast nationwide from Sunday night, which will cool down this latest run of the unseasonably warm weather. Now, once again, tomorrow we are looking at a hot day with partly cloudy skies and a high UV level. So for those of you be planning an outdoor trip, make sure to pack a hat and apply enough sunblock. Now going over to our temperature readings, Seoul will start off the Saturday morning at 15, 29 in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Daegu and Busan will peak up to 30 and 23 degrees. Now moving over to other regions, Jeju Island tops out at 25, Dokdo at 16, while Mankungang tops out at 24. Well, that's all I have at this moment. I'm Michelle Park, and back to you, Teddy.
All right, thank you very much for that, Michelle, with the weather. And that will do it for this Friday edition of Arirang News at 8. Happy Friday, everyone, and thanks for watching.